Rides Again is a 15-chapter film serial from Republic Pictures that premieres by the year 1939. Robert Livingston stars as Bill Andrews, which is an alias for his better-known identity, the Lone Ranger. Chief Thundercloud reprises his role as Tonto, the Lone Ranger's steadfast ally. Another ally is bequeathed onto the Ranger by the name of Juan Vasquez. Vasquez would come to be the Ranger's second sidekick in what has commonly become known as a superhero tradition of sorts. A misunderstanding leads to a fight, and then eventually both heroes team up after realizing their mistake.
You might be making a mistake. Hold it!
Go ahead, shoot me, like I did my brother.
Of course, the Lone Ranger had nothing to do with Juan's younger brother Diego being murdered. It turns out this was a fellow named Logan disguised as the Lone Ranger. The Ranger then talks Vasquez into holding off on his vendetta and aims to prove he is not the guilty party. It turns out that the Lone Ranger and Tonto are headed to San Ramon, New Mexico. New Mexico is a big-time cattle country, and cattleman Craig Dolan would just as soon not have a bunch of competition from Jed Scott and his party of homesteaders.
Who is this Craig Dolan?
He's the biggest cattleman in the West, and he's sworn to keep homesteaders from settling the country.
Vasquez ends up saving Scott's homesteader party from an ambush set by an outlaw group known as the Black Raiders. A gunfight ensues where Vasquez saves the life of a young man in particular named Bill Andrews. Juan's newfound friend then helps him to exact revenge against the man who murdered his brother and posed as the Lone Ranger. Now that Vasquez no longer blames the true Lone Ranger after the imposter's deathbed confession, the young man he saved reveals himself as the Ranger. From this point on, the two are bosom buddies, fighting side by side against the Black Raider gang.
Black Raiders, eh? Amigo, it looks like a job for the Lone Ranger.
I was a little concerned at first that the Vasquez character might overshadow Tonto's role as the Lone Ranger's sidekick. However, those concerns proved to be short-lived. If anything, I'd say the two characters got 50-50 screen time, with Vasquez serving as Andrews' sidekick and Tonto coming into play as the sidekick once Andrews dons the Lone Ranger mask.
Where did they take Gibson? Come on, talk. Where did they go?
Maybe Indian way make him talk. Please go around head tight. I'll talk.
The first time the Lone Ranger would appear in a comic book would be the promotional ice cream cone special from the year 1938. When the kiddies bought enough ice cream, they would get coupons to exchange for this comic book. The next time the Lone Ranger appears in an official comic book was in Dell's large feature comic, issue number 3, by the year 1939. This comic book series, along with others such as Dell's 4-color, contained reprints of the King Features Syndicate newspaper strips.
Your Honor, I can prove that Jed Scott is innocent.
Judge Miller, I object to a masked man being allowed to interfere with court proceedings.
The Lone Ranger has the respect of all law-abiding people. He stands for justice.
There's just not a whole lot of mystery in this film serial. The audience pretty much knows who the Lone Ranger is right up front, and there are plenty of masking and unmasking scenes. Craig Dolan's really not a bad guy. He's just a businessman who wants to raise cattle without a bunch of farmers getting in his way. His niece, Sue Dolan, often helps the Lone Ranger and tries to offer her help to the homesteaders, but they have a difficult time trusting a member of the Dolan family.
Quick!
Thank you, Miss Dolan. Those raiders are going to attack the Daniels party at Willow Springs. You can help me if you will.
Of course.
Good.
It becomes apparent pretty quickly that Craig's nephew Bart is actually the true mastermind behind the Black Raider gang. He's usually trying to throw the Lone Ranger or his sister off his trail by having his own men tie him up or hold him hostage. In the meantime, the Black Raiders continue to terrorize the homesteaders by attempting to burn their farming seed, stealing their land deeds, kidnapping their children, and rigging local elections. Luckily, the Lone Ranger, Tonto, and sometimes Juan are around to foil most of their nasty schemes.
Silver bullets. The Lone Ranger, he tricked you.
with the government horn.
They're more than likely in the land office by now.
Bart Dolan shows his true colors shooting his own uncle, Craig, when he learns of his underhanded dealings as the leader of the Black Raiders. Bart then holds his own sister Sue hostage so he can retreat to raise an army of thugs and outlaws for a final showdown with the Homesteaders and the Lone Ranger at Fort Adobe.
Hail Silver!
He's up ahead. Come on.
Apparently, the Ranger learned the art of super ventriloquism from Superman and is able to fool the Black Raiders into looking the other way as he makes a break for the fort. The Lone Ranger then returns with the literal United States cavalry to help the Homesteaders fight off the army of Black Raiders. In attempting to break open the entrance to the fort with a wagon filled with barrels of explosive powder, it leads to Bart Dolan's own undoing as he is blown to smithereens.
Won't you make your home with us?
No, my friends, I can't. In other parts of the Great West, injustice and oppression run riot. While such exist, we cannot rest.
We're so indebted to you. Won't you tell us who you are?
Allegedly, this is the infamous serial that Lone Ranger co-creator George W. Trendle disliked so much, which caused the Green Hornet property to be offered to Universal Pictures rather than Republic Pictures. The explanation offered is that Trendle didn't care for the constant unmasking of the Lone Ranger and his time spent in the civilian identity of Bill Andrews. Perhaps I'm biased by the disappointment of television series I grew up with as a child, where the secret identity to superhero ratio was usually 90-10, but I don't see what's so awful about the Lone Ranger rides again. Most of the scenes remind me of typical suiting up scenes in most blockbuster motion pictures about comic book heroes. I suppose you could try and argue that the Bill Andrews or even the Alan King secret identity from the previous serial is not the official true identity of the Lone Ranger, but in all fairness, the name John Reed hadn't even been established yet. Perhaps if Trendle had a philosophy more like Marvel Comics did in regards to the origin of Wolverine, he wouldn't have been so miffed. Marvel at least realized, hey, if we don't tell the story of Wolverine's origin soon, these new filmmakers will. Overall, this is a competent film serial, and most of the cliffhangers are resolved in a believable manner. Fans of the Lone Ranger may be thrown a bit by the inclusion of the new character Juan Vasquez, as well as the Bill Andrews secret identity, but they certainly add to the piece rather than take away.
Hail Silver! Away!
Amigo, it looks like a job for the Lone Ranger.